My parents smiled politely over dinner, then said the sentence that changed everything: inheritance is for achievers, not for failures. The table went quiet. Everyone waited for me to argue, to defend myself, to beg. I didn't. I just nodded. What they didn't know was that years earlier, they had quietly put my name on the trust, not as a favorite, not as an heir, but as a safeguard. And the moment they tried to use money as punishment, the system responded exactly as it was designed to. By morning, their trust fund was frozen. And suddenly, I wasn't the failure anymore. My name is Clara Bennett, and in my family, success was never something you felt. It was something you displayed. My parents, Howard and Elaine Bennett, believed achievement should be visible from across a room. Degrees framed on walls. Titles that sounded impressive at dinner parties. Cars that made valets nod with approval. If you couldn't point to it, measure it, or brag about it, it didn't count. I learned that early. Growing up, our house was quiet but curated. Conversations revolved around promotions, investments, and trajectory. My parents liked to say they were preparing us for the real world, but what they were really doing was teaching us a single rule. Worth had conditions. My siblings learned how to perform that rule perfectly. They chased the right careers, spoke the right language, learned how to look successful even on their worst days. They were rewarded with praise, introductions, and a kind of effortless confidence that comes from knowing you're approved of. I was different. Not rebellious. Not dramatic. Just quiet. I chose a career path that didn't come with applause. No flashy titles. No stories my parents could retell to their friends. I worked in financial compliance behind the scenes, technical, invisible, the kind of work people only notice when it goes wrong. I liked it that way. It made sense to me. Systems, rules, safeguards, structure. But in my parents' eyes, invisibility was failure. At family gatherings, I was described as still figuring things out even years into my career. My accomplishments were acknowledged politely, then quickly overshadowed. She's smart, my mother would say, followed by, but she doesn't really push herself. What she meant was, I didn't reflect well enough on them. The irony was that our family's wealth, the trust fund my parents spoke about like a crown jewel, was built on the very kind of work I did. Careful oversight. Boring diligence. People who paid attention when no one else did. But my parents didn't value what kept things standing. They valued what looked impressive while standing on top. And by the time they decided to define who deserved inheritance and who didn't, they had already decided something else too: who counted as a success and who would always be considered a disappointment, no matter how stable, capable, or prepared they actually were. The dinner was presented as a formality. Nothing serious, my mother said on the phone. Just family. That should have been my first warning. They chose a restaurant that favored quiet elegance over warmth, white tablecloths, low lighting, the kind of place where voices instinctively lower themselves. Success in my parents' world always came with a matching backdrop. We sat in our usual order. My parents at the center. My siblings close, angled inward. I took the seat at the end of the table, where no one had to turn their head to include me. The conversation began exactly as expected. Updates were offered. Promotions were celebrated. Numbers were shared like trophies. My father nodded approvingly at each familiar marker of progress, my mother smiling in that tight, polished way that meant everything was unfolding exactly as planned. Then the tone shifted. My father set his glass down carefully. Too carefully. We've been reviewing our estate plan, he said. It's time we talked about expectations. My mother took over from there. She always did when the message needed to land cleanly. We believe inheritance should reflect achievement, she said. Not potential. Not intentions. Her eyes flicked toward me, briefly. Long enough. Inheritance, she continued, is meant to reward success. We won't be funding failure. The words settled heavily on the table. No one reacted right away. Not because it was unclear, but because it was unmistakably clear. I was being discussed as a category, not a person. My father finally looked at me. This isn't personal, he said, which was how he announced things that were entirely personal. But some paths don't align with the values we're preserving. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I didn't defend myself. I simply nodded. What struck me most wasn't the decision itself. It was the assumption underneath it that shame would follow, that I would scramble for approval, that exclusion would bring me back into line. They believed the dinner ended with a verdict. They didn't realize it was only the moment everything became irreversible. What my parents believed about me had very little to do with who I actually was. To them, I was the child who never quite launched, the one who didn't chase recognition, didn't network aggressively, didn't talk about money unless asked. Silence, in their world, was the same as stagnation. They assumed I needed them. That assumption had been convenient for years. It allowed them to speak to me slowly, carefully, like someone still finding her footing. It allowed them to offer advice I hadn't asked for, framed as concern but laced with judgment. You'll understand one day, my mother liked to say, when you're more established. What they never asked was what I actually did. I worked in financial compliance and oversight structures that existed precisely to prevent misuse of power. I spent my days reading documents most people skimmed, looking for language that could be bent, clauses that could be abused, decisions that looked ethical on the surface but failed under scrutiny. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't loud. But it required precision, patience, and a kind of discipline that didn't show up in conversation. Years earlier, when my parents updated their trust, they'd needed someone neutral, someone responsible, someone who wouldn't treat it like a personal weapon. My name had been added quietly, not as a beneficiary with influence, but as a co-administrative safeguard. A technical role. A formality. They forgot about it the moment the papers were signed. They remembered the narrative instead. That I was behind, uncertain, dependent. So when they spoke that night about failure, they believed they were delivering a consequence, a lesson, a correction. They didn't realize they were speaking to the only person in the room who fully understood the system they were trying to control. Or that systems, when pushed too hard, have a way of responding on their own. That night, after the dinner plates were cleared and the verdict quietly delivered, I went home and opened my laptop. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted revenge, but because when something is framed as final, I've learned to verify the fine print. The trust documents were stored exactly where they had always been, encrypted, organized, untouched for years. My parents liked the idea of control, but they hated maintenance. Once something was signed and filed, they rarely revisited it. In their minds, authority didn't require review. I read every page. Slowly. Carefully. Line by line. The trust was extensive layers of language designed to protect assets across decades. Distribution schedules. Tax strategies. Administrative hierarchies. Most of it was standard. Conservative. Predictable. Then I reached a section I remembered helping draft years earlier, back when the trust had been restructured after a family disagreement that never quite healed. Compliance and ethics safeguards. Buried beneath neutral headings was a clause few people ever paid attention to. It outlined conditions under which the trust would automatically enter a temporary administrative freeze. No distributions, no transfers, no discretionary access. One condition stood out immediately. If the trust was used as leverage to coerce behavior, punish personal life choices, or impose subjective moral judgments unrelated to financial stewardship, the system would respond on its own. No vote required. No administrator override. Just an automatic halt pending review. I leaned back in my chair. It wasn't dramatic language. It wasn't emotional. It was precise. Almost boring. The kind of clause people agree to because it sounds reasonable and then forget exists. The irony settled in slowly. My parents believed they had drawn a line that night. That by labeling success and failure they were reinforcing order. But in doing so, they had crossed directly into the territory the trust itself was designed to prevent. They thought authority lived in their intent. They forgot it lived in the structure. I closed the document without changing a single thing. There was nothing to trigger manually. Nothing to report. The trust didn't need my opinion. It only needed time. And for the first time since the dinner, I allowed myself a quiet, steady thought. Not of vindication, but of inevitability. Systems don't argue. They just respond. The next morning, my phone started ringing before I finished my coffee. Not a casual call. Not a check-in. Panic has a sound, and I recognized it immediately. By the time I answered, My mother's voice was already tight, clipped, stripped of its usual composure. "There's a problem," she said. "The accounts aren't accessible." I let her speak. Distributions had failed overnight. Scheduled transfers showed as pending, then rejected. Their financial advisor couldn't see past a system notice marked temporary administrative hold. My father took the phone next. "What did you do?" he asked, skipping pleasantries entirely. I looked at the steam rising from my mug and waited a moment before answering. "I didn't do anything." Silence. "That's not funny," my mother snapped. "Fix it." There. It was the reflex. The assumption that I could be commanded back into place. That whatever lever had been pulled could simply be pushed the other way. "I can't," I said calmly. "And neither can you." The accusations came fast after that. That I was being petty. That I was retaliating. That I was trying to prove a point. My father's voice rose with each sentence, as if volume might restore access. Finally, I said the only thing that mattered. "I didn't freeze the trust." The trust froze itself. They didn't understand at first. They kept circling the same question, rephrasing it, looking for a confession that didn't exist. I explained it the way I would to a colleague, neutral, factual, detached. The compliance clause. The automatic trigger. The review period. No discretion. No exceptions. The call ended abruptly. An hour later, messages replaced calls. Lawyers were being contacted. Advisors looped in. Panic reframed as urgency. I set my phone face down and went about my day. Not because I didn't care, but because for the first time, the rules they'd trusted to protect their power were doing exactly what they were designed to do without asking anyone's permission. By midday, the panic had spread. What began as a technical issue quickly became a crisis no one could contain. Lawyers confirmed what my parents refused to accept. The freeze wasn't personal, and it wasn't optional. The trust had entered a compliance review period. And until that process concluded, no distributions would move. There was nothing to override. No emergency call to make it disappear. That was when the blame started shifting. My siblings, who had stayed quiet during the dinner, suddenly found their voices. Group messages lit up with accusations that had nothing to do with me. "Why would you phrase it like that? Why now? Why provoke this?" The inheritance they had counted on, planned around, was suddenly unreachable. My parents responded the only way they knew how, defensively. They insisted they were misunderstood. That they had been motivating, not punishing. That everyone was overreacting. But systems don't respond to intent. They respond to language. The family narrative fractured quickly. Old resentments surfaced. Past slights were dragged into the open. Conversations that had been carefully avoided for years were suddenly unavoidable, fueled by the shared realization that control had slipped through everyone's fingers at once. I stayed out of it. Not out of spite, but because nothing I said would help. This wasn't an emotional problem anymore. It was structural. And structure has a way of forcing honesty where politeness fails. By evening, my father called again. His tone changed. Quieter, measured. The advisors had explained the only path forward. Remove the punitive language. Restore neutral criteria. Acknowledge misuse of discretion. Until then, the trust would remain frozen. It was the first time I heard uncertainty in his voice. They had built their authority on the belief that money kept everyone aligned. But the moment the money stopped moving, the illusion of unity collapsed with it. What remained was something far less comfortable. Accountability, finally directed inward. When my parents asked what it would take to fix this, I didn't answer right away. Not because I enjoyed the leverage, but because leverage was exactly what had caused the problem in the first place. I asked for a copy of the revised language their attorneys were proposing. No emotional calls. No family meeting. Just the documents. If this was going to be resolved, it needed to happen the same way it had broken on paper. The changes were simple, almost disappointingly so. Remove subjective qualifiers like success and failure. Eliminate language that tied distributions to personal life choices. Restore the trust to its original purpose, financial stewardship, not behavioral control. No apologies were requested. No public acknowledgments demanded. No rewriting of family history. Just boundaries. I made it clear that I wouldn't argue about the past or negotiate feelings. This wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. It was about making sure the trust could never be used as a threat again against me or anyone else. My parents hesitated. I could hear it even through emails. Because agreeing meant admitting something they'd spent years denying, that authority had limits, and they had crossed one. But eventually, they signed. The trust language was revised, neutralized, stripped of judgment. I didn't gloat. I didn't lecture. When the freeze lifted, I stepped back from the administrative role entirely, transferring oversight to an independent professional. Control, I had learned, didn't have to look like dominance. Sometimes, it looked like restraint. And choosing not to weaponize power, especially when you're finally holding it, was the quietest way to prove you never needed it to begin with. When the trust was restored, nothing returned to the way it had been before. On paper, the structure was functional again. Distributions resumed. Advisors moved on. The crisis, as my parents preferred to call it, was technically over. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, my parents were forced to confront the gap between what they had valued and what had actually sustained them. They had mistaken visibility for competence, confidence for control. They believed success was proven by noise, by titles announced at dinners and numbers recited like credentials. What they called my failure had never been a lack of ambition. It had been a refusal to perform. I had chosen stability over spectacle, understanding over approval, work that protected systems rather than glorified individuals. And when the moment came when pressure tested their carefully curated authority, it wasn't the loudest voices that held things together. It was the quiet structure they had barely noticed. They never apologized. I didn't expect them to. Some realizations arrived too late to be spoken aloud. But in the way conversations changed shorter, less certain, I could tell they understood something they hadn't before. That the child they dismissed had been the one making sure everything didn't collapse. Failure, it turned out, was never about falling behind. It was about confusing image with substance and learning the difference only after the illusion stopped working. If you've made it this far, I want to speak to you directly, not as a character in a story but as a person who learned something the hard way. If you believe I was right to stay calm, to choose boundaries over revenge, to let systems speak louder than anger, I hope you'll say so in the comments. Your words matter more than you think. Stories like mine don't survive without people who recognize quiet strength when they see it. What I learned is this: control disguised as love is still control. And no amount of money, inheritance, or approval is worth surrendering your dignity. You don't have to prove your worth by performing for people who only value appearances. Real stability comes from understanding your position, protecting yourself legally and emotionally, and knowing when silence is power, not weakness. If you're in a situation where family uses guilt, money, or expectations to pressure you, pause. Read the fine print of documents, yes, but also of relationships. Ask yourself who benefits when you stay quiet, and who benefits when you finally stand firm. If this story resonated with you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever been underestimated and what you did about it. Your story might help someone else find their strength too.